Redeemer Queens Park exists to help connect Jesus to people, people to community, and community to mission. And I just want to welcome you to another gathering of Redeemer Queens Park. Thanks so much for dropping in today. Listen, we need to talk about death. The rich, the poor, the famous, the infamous, the foreigner and the local, they all have one thing in common. They are all going to die. The death rate's holding strong at 100%. Every birth certificate has an unwritten expiration date on it. We are all going to die. And we need, in this moment right here, to think and talk about death. The sixth of the 7 signs that Jesus did to show us the way to life deals with death. And we want to follow Jesus into this scene where a man named Lazarus, who has been dead for 4 days, is going to get raised from the dead. All the action is in John chapter 11. It's 44 verses, which we won't have time to look at every one of them in great detail. We want to spend some time after this talk really having a good look at it going through. But check out the introduction, the first 4 verses. We learn a few things. You see Lazarus is ill. You see the village of Mary and her sister Martha in Bethany is where the action is going down. And Jesus says something very interesting at the start as we're having a look at the text. In verse 4, this illness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. Well, let's set the scene, if you will. There's 3 siblings, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. Lazarus is ill. Apparently, he's about to die. And Mary and Martha, in the humility of their request, just send word to Jesus. Hey, the one you love is ill. I find it fascinating. They don't even ask him to come. They just know Jesus loves this one and he would know what to do in a situation like this. They were appealing to Jesus on the basis of Jesus' love for Lazarus and for them. We've heard of Mary and Martha before, and something very interesting happens. Jesus declines the request of these friends that he loves. He moves us into the next part where Jesus sets the scene in verses 5 to 16. Check it out, verses 5 to 16. Jesus loved Martha and her sister Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed where he was 2 more days. Now that is a baffling piece of scripture that we're going to need to spend some time on. Then he said, let's go back to Judea. And then down in verse 14, you see it there. He told them plainly, Lazarus is dead, and for your sake I am glad that I was not there, so that you may believe. Wow. Let's think about it together. This encounter with Jesus has a number of puzzling bits to it, and we're going to get across the first of them right now. Jesus' delay, Jesus' 2-day delay from only 2 miles away, it seems to be the space of time where Lazarus has lost his life. And Jesus is saying, I'm glad. Jesus is saying, I love you, so I'm not going to come to you right now. Lazarus died while Jesus declined their request. And what makes this so difficult to understand is the love of Jesus is what's clearly at work. This is like saying on Valentine's Day this last week, look, I love my wife so much that I forgot to get her something for Valentine's Day. If you're listening to this, you're like, I'm sorry, what? How in the world does forgetting to get your wife something communicate your love for her? Well, something similar is playing out right here in the text. But Jesus' delay did not arise from indifference. It did not arise from distance, though he was only 2 miles away. His delay provided the space to emphasize his love for Lazarus, his love for Mary and Martha, and to give all of them something better than extending Lazarus' earthly life by just a few more days. The physical death of Lazarus, what we're about to see next, actually created space for them to have life. Not to have physical earthly life, as great as this is, but to have a fullness of life now that would last for all of eternity. So Jesus says, let's go to Judea. Yeah, this is a weighty encounter with Jesus. He is intentionally waiting, and he apparently lets Lazarus die in order to carry out a greater purpose in the lives of the people he loves. All this has so much to say for how we understand God and how we meet with God and can trust he's with us in our own moments of need. Jesus has a way of dealing with death. His purposes are higher than ours. Let's pause and think on this as we go into the next bit. So friend, very lovingly, how do you deal with death? How do you deal with the death of a family member or a loved one? How do you deal with the thought of your own death? Well, the Bible provides resource for us. John chapter 11 tells us about how two different people dealt with death. First, we see how Martha deals with the death of her brother Lazarus in verses 17 to 27. Verse 21, Martha says, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Oh, the words of pain of someone wanting to stay close to Jesus in the face of death. Verse 23, Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha, moving into a very heady discourse at this point, she says, well, look, I know he's going to rise again on the resurrection on the last day. And this is the point. Jesus is saying, Martha, I am the resurrection. I am the last day. Whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Oh, friends, this is massive. This is absolutely massive what is being claimed here. It must be noted that Jesus is back in Judea and he's among the enemy. This was a threatening and not an inviting place for him to be and for these things to be being said. You can feel the tension among his followers as they even talk about and discuss the location. And these two sisters, they have dramatically different reactions to Jesus. They respond to death in different ways. Mary kind of responds in her head, whereas Martha responds in her head, whereas Mary is going to respond very much in her heart. Martha hurries out to meet Jesus. Her words are an appeal to Jesus to intervene 4 days into death. She has total trust in Jesus, but she sees Jesus as an intercessor like Elijah. Jesus' answer to her with an affirmation, it actually seems like they're kind of missing each other. Martha seems to have these ideas about death. Well, look, Jesus, I know in the last day he'll be all right. But the way she's even talking makes it feel like this is a cold comfort to her. And here's Jesus. Martha, I am the resurrection. I am the last day. I am the end of time. I am the judgment that people are going to stand before. It's not some other day, Martha. Jesus is saying it's me. Well, this is Jesus meeting Martha where Martha is. Martha, who knows Jesus to be this powerful leader, is actually challenged in her dealing of death to trust Jesus as the resurrection and the life. Well, that's Martha, but how about Mary? Verses 28 to 37. Mary deals with death in a different way. And look, I take a lot of encouragement from this. It's okay for us to approach hard situations and things like death and respond in different ways. Whereas Martha is clearly emotional, but she needs to talk it through very logically and reasonably. Mary is going to feel her way through this one. Look at Mary in verse 32. Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, and she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." The sisters respond with the same saying. And in verse 33, he was deeply moved in his spirit and he was troubled. Well, let's think about this. Mary hears about Jesus' arrival. She runs to Jesus. She doesn't run to the place of death. She runs to the one in whom death cannot exist. And when she gets there, she makes no request. She just falls at his feet and she weeps. Well, Jesus responds to Mary different than he responds to Martha. Jesus met Martha in the mind with a theological proposition for her to consider, and Jesus meets Mary in the dust, in the tears, and the brokenness of the moment. Don't miss it, friend. Jesus was moved with the deepest emotion possible in his conflict with death. Jesus had stern words for those affected by illness in Mark 1. He wept over the unrepenting heart of Jerusalem in Luke 19:41. He felt agony in the Garden of Eden in Mark chapter 14. And all these emotions, these are things that he feels when he comes into conflict with the prince of the world. So why did Jesus get so emotional? Well, part of it was meeting Mary where she was. Part of it was feeling a world of emotion in the face of death. Part of it was missing a friend. But the great part of it is that we need to see how Jesus responds to death. And Jesus responds to death with brokenness and emotion, like we'll see more of in this next part.
wanna let go of 1,000 other things, but when it comes to your love, I can't forget.
So friend, we're considering the different responses to death. We're considering the different ways of dealing with death in John chapter 11. And finally, and most importantly, let's consider how Jesus deals with death. Make no mistake about it, friend, he got emotional. He was deeply moved in verses 33 and 38. It's actually a deeply deficient English translation to say he's deeply moved. We don't have a good English word to communicate this Greek word. One scholar says that he is literally translated as he snorted. It has the idea and connotation of an animal getting ready to go in anger. It's as if Jesus is getting ready to charge. And here we see in verses 38 to 44, Jesus deals with death. Verse 38, he was deeply moved. And then in verse 40, he looks and he says, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" Then in verse 42, "that you may believe" is in his prayer to the Father. And then in verse 44, the dead man came out. Augustine tells us Jesus had to actually qualify this command to come out of the grave with the word of Lazarus, because if Jesus didn't specify, all the dead would have been raised. John Calvin says this word indicates that Jesus was entering the ring. The language here, according to Calvin, says, like a wrestler preparing for a contest with a hated foe, the violent tyranny of death, which he came to overcome, stands before the eyes of Jesus. Jesus' groan is not a groan of sympathy, but it's a preparation for battle. I can't read this without imagining Muhammad Ali or Anthony Joshua in the language of a fighter preparing to get in the ring to deal death its final blow. In verse 43, Jesus shouts at death in a loud voice. So can't you see it? Snorting, shouting, yelling. This is a battle that is beginning to take place. Jesus, the only way that Jesus could stop the funeral of Lazarus was to initiate his own funeral. And in John chapter 11, Jesus begins to do just that. This act of raising Lazarus from the dead is the very thing that will get Jesus killed one day. And that is what he came to do. The ultimate lifting up and inviting all people to himself. Death is a powerful curse, but Jesus is the author of life. And here it is, the author of life stepping into creation to take on death himself. The depth of death and the love of Christ meet in this context, and Christ conquers. This is as good as it gets in the story of the Gospel of John until Jesus rises from the dead himself. An immovable object meets an irresistible force. Death meets Christ, and Christ conquers death. Jesus has dealt with death. He's done it for everyone who would believe in him. This is where we can sing, "I stand amazed in the presence." He took our sin and our sorrow. He made it his very own. He bore our burden to Calvary, and he suffered and died alone. And Christian, when you feel alone in your suffering, when you feel alone in your pain, when you feel alone in the midst of a loved one, a family member, or a friend, you can know you don't have to be alone as you see this sign of Jesus and you believe in him. Jesus' apparent absence did not indicate that he lost control or faltered in his love for this family. And as you believe in Jesus, Jesus' apparent absence in our own lives doesn't mean we're missing out on him as well. So whoever you are, wherever you're coming from, and whatever you're facing, are you going to resist him? He is your only shot at beating death. The death rate holds strong at 100%. He is your only hope at beating death in this life and experiencing a full life now. So look at this sign of Jesus, this one who can deal with death. See him, believe in him, and enjoy the full life that only he can give now and for all eternity.